morning, everyone. That's just gone 11 o'clock, so it's lovely to welcome you all to this event on collective wellbeing and democracy. I'm Sarah Davidson, Chief Executive here at Carnegie UK. If you're not already familiar with us, Carnegie UK is a public policy foundation, and we work across the UK and Ireland with a mission to improve wellbeing. A few housekeeping issues before we start. Please do put your questions into the Q&A. We're hoping to leave good time for these after we've heard from our panellists this morning. So please don't hold back and just pop them in as they occur to you as we go through. We're tweeting along at hashtag democratic wellbeing. That's popped in the chat below if you'd like to have a look at that. Please do join the conversation and share thoughts both with those who are on the webinar and with those who can't be in the room today. And then finally, we're recording this. So if you want to catch up afterwards or if you want to share it with other people, then there'll be a link which we'll make available after the event. At Carnegie UK, we define collective wellbeing as everyone having what they need to live well now and in the future. And we've long had an interest in this question of how you assess a society's progress against this broad set of measures, rather than just reverting to GDP, as tends to be the norm. When we looked at how that measurement is done in the UK, we found that there was minimal attention paid to the democratic aspects of wellbeing, and that really piqued our interest. For us, democratic wellbeing comes about when everyone has a voice in decisions that affect them. It's fundamentally participative and engaging, and it involves sharing power with individuals and communities. A prerequisite for that kind of collaborative involvement in democratic processes and decision-making is public trust in government. The OECD has said that trust is the foundation of a functioning democratic system, and it's absolutely fundamental for maintaining public participation in politics. So we set out in December 2021 to check the temperature of democratic wellbeing in the UK, and I'll be sharing the findings of that shortly. You probably don't need me to remind you that that was a particularly febrile time for trust in government in the UK. And so we thought it would be interesting to come back 12 months on from that original publication and check in on how things are going, and to ask what we can do now to improve our democratic wellbeing. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined this morning to explore these questions by two women who have a strong interest in and distinctive perspectives on this topic. I'll allow them to introduce themselves, and in doing so, to invite with us what it was that first piqued their personal and professional interest in democracy. I'm going to turn first to Jo Swinson, who is the Director of Partners for a New Economy. Jo.
Thank you, Sarah, and it's wonderful to be here today. As you say, I'm Director of Partners for a New Economy, which is a philanthropic grant-making fund trying to change the economic system. I like a big challenge. And previously, those who are in the UK might know me from my time in politics as a Member of Parliament, Government Minister and leader of the Liberal Democrats in 2019. And my interest in democracy was piqued by really, I suppose, a combination of always really wanting to change the world. I remember as a child being inspired by Anita Roddick and going into the Body Shop to buy my banana-shaped soap and getting to the till and signing a petition, because there was always a petition at the till. So that sort of activism and campaigning was really something which I got interested in at a very young age. And then when I was about 11 at secondary school, the Debating Society held an annual parliamentary debate as part of a nationwide programme. And that really made me look in a little bit more detail at democracy, at the different political parties. And I think that was when I got particularly interested in the kind of political side of democracy. And that interest obviously stayed and has been with me in various guises over my whole career and life since. So really interested in this topic, which I think is a hugely important topic, and looking forward to the discussion with you, Sarah and Martha.
Thanks so much, Jo. And Martha, Director of the Civic Power Fund, do please introduce yourself.
Thanks so much, and it's really fab to be here today, so thank you for having me. Just to recap, so I'm the Director of the Civic Power Fund, and the Civic Power Fund, we are an intermediary funder, so we're raising resources that we can re-grant specifically to grassroots community organising and democratic engagement work. And I'll come on a little bit later to say a bit more why that is. But really, as a fund, we're motivated by quite a deep concern about the state of democracy in the UK, and a really kind of burning sense that one of the ways that we can improve democracy is by significantly investing in that grassroots energy and agency that comes through community organising. But I would say that my personal interest in this, similar to Jo, started at quite a young age. I grew up in a very political household, and really that was for two reasons. My mum had grown up in quite challenging circumstances, but had had her life transformed by government policies. So we always had this sense in our household that government and politics could be a force for good. And my mum had tried to give back by becoming a local councillor, and she did a lot of work in the community to try and sort of change people's lives through politics. So I had this deep sense growing up that yes, politics could be broken, but it could also be amazing. And then I went off to university and I had a chance to learn all about this amazing practice of community organising, and saw firsthand about actually if we come together and we work together at a local level through organising, we can build this base of power that really transforms our systems. So I think those two things really shaped in me this belief that politics can be a force for good, but only if we strengthen democracy through continued engagement. And that's kind of really shaped my career and perspective, and is the energy that we're bringing to the Civic Power Fund.
That's fantastic. Thanks both of you so much. And I'm dying to hear more from both of you. So I'm not going to take too much time, but I did want to frame today's discussion back where it all started in our published research findings from 12 months ago. So if I could have the first slide up, please. Thank you. So I referred earlier to Carnegie UK's definition of collective well-being. And one of the key aspects of this desired state of well-being is a balancing of social, economic, environmental and democratic well-being outcomes. And a well-functioning state, so one which pursues these collective well-being aspirations, attends to progress across all of these outcomes and uses them to guide decision-making. And it also collects data which tells governments and their citizens about how the government, how the country is doing across a broad range of measures. When we looked at how the ONS, the Office of National Statistics in the UK, measures democratic well-being, we found that there were only two measures. Trust in government, which is measured at a European level and with quite a long time lag on the data, and turnout at general elections, which is also obviously by definition not captured more than once every 4 or 5 years. And this told us very little about power dynamics and about participation and about voice. And you can see from the screen there and the breakdown of what it is that we mean when we talk about democratic well-being, why those things matter so much. So we worked with YouGov to develop a questionnaire that drew on OECD and other sources to give us some data about how our understanding of democratic well-being was being experienced in the UK. We didn't plan it this way, but the fieldwork ended up being done in mid-December 2021, just as the first Partygate stories were breaking. And therefore, at what we hoped then was a uniquely low point for trust and confidence in politics, at least at national level. But the data is what it is, even if it represents a snapshot in time. And the headline finding was that 41% of people in the UK said that democracy wasn't working. And people further said that the biggest threat to democracy was a loss of trust. 32% said that, followed by corruption at 16%. 74% of people didn't trust the UK government to make decisions that would improve their lives. And later on, the same polling showed that in addition to the loss of trust, there were also issues with the current levels of participation in decision-making in the UK and about misinformation. And you can see how this risks a vicious cycle where people who've got no confidence in the decision will opt out of participating even where they're invited to do so. We were also interested in values, and we found a misalignment between what might be thought of as commonly held public values or values associated with public life, and those which were at that time associated with the UK government. And honesty and integrity were most frequently cited as being absent from the list that we shared with people. Now, as I've said, the polling for this report took place at a time when the news agenda was particularly focused on trust in and truthfulness of the then current UK government. But it's important to recognise it was also against a backdrop of a long-term decline in political trust in Britain. The British Social Attitudes Survey, which measures this, commented that political trust in Britain had fallen to an all-time low in 2019 due to the parliamentary stalemate over Brexit and the regular reporting of that. But findings in 2020 had found that levels of trust and confidence had then risen back up to pre-Brexit levels. We can speculate that might be attributed to the sense of Brexit having been done, or to the handling of the pandemic in the early crisis phase, or to a mixture of both. So while the long-term trend on trust in government is unclear, it does appear that recovery from low points is technically possible. And that brings us to our question for today, which is, where are we now? And where might we go next? And that brings me back to my panelists to throw that question to them. 12 months on, are there any signs that the health of democracy and our democratic well-being are improving? And if so, where are we seeing those green shoots of recovery? And I'm going to come first to Jo with that question.
Thank you, Sarah, and a fascinating time for you to have done your field work on this research, for sure. I mean, I just looking at the national picture, I think one of the causes for optimism is that Boris Johnson is no longer Prime Minister. And I don't say that as a partisan point. I say that, I hope, in a fairly uncontroversial way, to say that what we saw in terms of the carelessness and casual relationship with the truth, exemplified by the Partygate scandal, but that was by no means the only example of it, that in itself was corrosive for trust in politics and our democracy more generally. And it is therefore a good thing that ultimately there was a mechanism within the system that righted that situation. And whatever your view of the merits and demerits of Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, and I'm sure that on this webinar there's a wide range of opinions on that, I think we can all agree that both of them have a relationship with the truth that is a big improvement on where we were at this time last year in terms of the occupant of number 10. So I think that is a good thing. I think there is a challenge in terms of agency, however, when you change a prime minister and there isn't an election. And that is just the way our system works. Obviously, we've done that twice in the last 12 months and with kind of shrinking electorates. So initially it was the electorate of Conservative Party members and then ultimately really just the Conservative MPs effectively. So I think there's an agency issue there where, you know, most people in the country haven't really had the opportunity to vote for the person who is leading the country. And that's a feature of our democracy, but it's probably not an ideal situation. I think there are other signs of optimism, and I'll maybe just finish with this one, because it's quite easy to get all doom and gloom when we look at the political situation. But I think the other thing to just note is we had elections in 2022, local elections right across the country in many places. And for the first time in Wales, 16 and 17-year-olds were able to cast their votes. And I think that is a really good sign. You've got a group of young people there who were previously disenfranchised, who are now able to go and have the agency of making that democratic decision. And this is something which in Scotland has already been happening for 7 or 8 years now. And the impact of that, I'm sure there's many studies that will be written on it, but basically for young people to have that engagement is a positive thing. And I certainly found when I was an MP representing a Scottish constituency, the engagement of young people from the fact that they could actually go and cast their vote, and that you know, having civic education in school, they then very soon, you know, while they were still in education in many cases, would be able to go and vote, was something which was a very positive kind of reinforcing pattern. So some signs of positive optimism, as well as you know, obviously trust can take a long time to rebuild. It is easily lost and it is hard to win back, but not impossible.
Yeah. Thank you. Martha, what are you seeing out and about nowadays?
Well, I might kind of flip Jo's perspective and start from the very local, because I think that's where we're seeing, again, some reasons to be really hopeful. And I said at the beginning that the Civic Power Fund, we invest specifically in community organising as this deep-rooted practice that allows people with shared issues, shared concerns to come together, build relationships, and through those relationships build up a base of power that can meaningfully engage with on a day-to-day basis their politics, their democracy, their elected representatives, and thus win change that really matters to them, but also create more accountable democracies, which are utterly vital, as we saw from your presentation, to democratic well-being. And we've just opened a new community action fund, which is trying to get money out the door to some of the most rooted work that's happening across the UK in this space. And the thing that gives us so much hope is just what an overwhelming response we've had to that fund. And we knew already, and that's why we created the Civic Power Fund, that there was this incredible energy coming through our communities and want and need to kind of reverse some of these trends. And now we're really seeing it in real time. And we've had hundreds of applications, thousands of expressions of interests from groups that are deeply rooted in their community, doing incredible service delivery work, but desperate to do more. They want to engage with politics. They want to engage in democracy. They want their voice to be heard. And they're looking for funding, support, collaboration that will allow them to do that. So I feel really hopeful about what's possible. But I do also think it's utterly vital that we kind of seize the momentum of this moment. And there are a few things that we're thinking about at the moment. One is actually, how do we change the funding landscape to make sure that these groups really can draw on resources for the long term and really support these efforts? But also, what does it look like to kind of shift democracy and really build on this energy so that people aren't disappointed once again? And I'm really interested, we're doing this on February the 1st. There's strikes all across the country at the moment. Friends of mine who've never been political are out on strike as nurses and teachers and really kind of using their rights to engage with the democratic process. And I think that's really exciting in many ways. But I think what comes next is vital. So will whatever happens with the next election actually deliver change? Will it inspire communities? Will we actually win kind of meaningful progress in these spaces? And will people feel like that exercise of their voice, that being kind of engaged and active, is actually having an impact? And I think that's the bit that feels utterly critical right now.
So thanks so much, Martha. And I'd like to stay, if I may, for a moment with what's happening at grassroots. And I wonder, it would be interesting to hear both, perhaps some specific examples of things that you're particularly excited about. But I'm also interested in where you see success connecting the people who want to have their voices heard and who want to influence things and those who are taking the decisions. What are the conditions that enable people to be heard and enable people to act on the voice of the community? So that, I guess, so that you break out of that cycle of disappointment that you described.
So I think there's a few things that we've learned in this space. One is that right now there's quite a kind of limited community bandwidth to actually take this work forward. We're seeing communities are facing a cost of living crisis and they're patching up kind of key services. And so I do think there's a really critical role for us as funders in terms of making sure that we can go in and we can fund this work for the long term and that we can reduce competition, we can reduce short-term project-based funding so that groups can really draw on sustainable resources that can move them beyond that kind of day-to-day service delivery to building up the coalitions, the collaborations that actually start to win change. But I do then think there's a really kind of vital bit in this in terms of that sort of capacity building and what are we doing again at a local level, but also at a national level to provide access to like training around things like community organising, political education. This is who your elected representatives are. This is how you influence them, really kind of injecting that knowledge at a local base. But in terms of some examples, like some of the stuff that I would draw on that we're really excited about is one that we're working with an amazing organisation called the Centre for Progressive Change. And the Centre for Progressive Change are really kind of mobilising at a grassroots level domestic workers and particularly workers across our economy that don't really have access to fair sick pay. And they've been doing some really sort of deep rooted local work that is starting to build up kind of local coalitions and mean that they can influence local councillors, members of parliament, but they're also kind of building this umbrella national campaign so that they can try and win long-term political change where it needs to happen. And I think that's been an incredible example. And they're doing some work, for example, in north of Greater Manchester, and they've got 40 local groups involved, but they keep that feedback loop in terms of actually building up a national movement for change as well. And I think another example is that we're working with a group called Ward's Corner Community Benefit Society, and they are basically the outcome of a 20-year campaign all about local democracy in Tottenham that has been trying to save the Latin village in that area and all the heritage and history and community around that space. And they've spent kind of 20 years fighting off various attempts to override them. And they've now built this amazing community benefit society that is reinvesting profit, energy back in the area, building up something really sustainable that means that they might well win a redevelopment bid of their own that really kind of represents the wants and needs of the community. But now they're connecting with like-minded groups all over the country to share their perspective on what works, but also to build movements where there's kind of common interest and common energy. So I think that's something else as well, just in terms of that investment at a local level, but then helping it spread out and share those lessons and see what is possible.
No, thank you so much. That's really helpful colour to give a sense of what's happening in communities. And I wonder, Jo, in your experience of operating politically at a national level, how easy is it to connect those types of things with the thinking that is done about policy development and policy implementation on a much bigger scale?
I mean, I think the building up of this civic power, and I think the fund that Martha's leading is absolutely amazing and necessary, because it needs resourcing. So that, I mean, that's the kind of key thing here, right? People might be able to give their time, but even their ability to give their time is limited by, we're in a cost of living crisis. Many people are, struggling to make ends meet, sometimes working 2 or 3 jobs. That is definitely a constraining factor for participation within democracy, and then actually just resources as well. So, I mean, the basic truth is, if you are wealthy in our democracy, you basically have more of a voice, and that's both at the kind of extreme end where political donations and lobbying, the very wealthy industries, they all have so many paid lobbyists. If you look at the COP, the number of like fossil fuel lobbyists kind of is hundreds and hundreds of people. So you've got that kind of vested interests having a say within our democracy that is certainly outsized, and that really needs to be balanced by people power, and yet the barriers to that are also significant. So the resourcing is crucial. I mean, I think in terms of where that organizing exists, like the democratic systems, certainly through constituency representation, are able to engage with it. I think sometimes the structures of government find that harder, and certainly I even find that when I was engaging with my local authority, the way in which local government is able to do that also often leaves a lot to be desired. Like, both at local and national level, there is a requirement to consult, and like the consultation process that happens is woefully inadequate. It's a tick box exercise, and occasionally something will change as a result of it, but it's often being done because it has to be done, rather than a sort of blank sheet of paper and saying, right, we're thinking that we might develop this part of the community, or here's a challenge that we're facing, how might we go about addressing it. Involving people at that early stage is really important if you want to get buy-in, rather than coming up with a plan and then presenting it to people as a fait accompli, yes or no, and maybe you can tweak a tiny element of it. But of course, that also takes time, it takes thinking. And certainly from a local government perspective, I don't want to be overly critical, because local government has been, absolutely starved of resources. A heads up, the government of which I was part definitely cut far too much from local government. And so the ability of those officials to be able to be innovative and to reach out and get that community involvement is not what it ought to be. So I think it can still happen. I think where you've got organised groups, it is obviously easier to for officials in local government or national government to engage. But there's also a mindset that is necessary there, right? And that mindset is not always there. Sometimes it is. I've seen it done really well, but I've also seen the kind of attitude that the public is a problem to be managed, rather than a kind of asset and a kind of resource, even where there's a great wealth of ideas and engagement, and where you've got lots of people engaged. That's a great thing. Yeah, it's like probably a bit irritating sometimes, things take a bit longer and you want to press ahead with something and it's like, oh my goodness, how do we deal with all these competing views? But if you have people engaged, I mean, that is brilliant. That's the whole point.
Yeah, I was really interested in your final point there in particular, Jo. I think that reflects a lot of the research work that we've done in recent years as well, which is that very often, particularly at a local level, agencies' understanding of how to engage people is through a written consultation exercise. And in fact, that is, as we know, woefully inadequate actually as a means of enabling people to participate. And I think it's really interesting, this question of how much that's about a lack of capacity and innovation, how much it's about a fear of what happens when you open up discussions where you may not have the answers and you might not need other people's answers. And I think it's also sometimes something about how people understand their role. And very often where you see or come across local authorities which understand their role as being kind of curators of place and enablers of people in place, you see really, really interesting things happening, but that's not universal. Martha, I wonder if that reflects your experience as well.
Yeah, it does. And I think that one of the things that we've been giving a lot of thought to at the moment at the Civic Power Fund is what is the role of people power in a wider, like, functioning, healthy, democratic ecosystem. And I think for me, there's something about the fact that we do need local government, national government that is much more responsive to communities, that sort of seeks that engagement and that openness because they trust and they want to hear and they want to know. I do think kind of more devolution is going to be key to that. It's really releasing power. So there is genuine and meaningful power at a local level. But I think one of the things that will never change, and that's why this investment in organising and building people power is so important, is the need to also have external outside pressure that holds governments and politicians to account. And I think that we definitely need much more responsive, and we need to be thinking from a public policy perspective that we'll get much better outcomes if we do this. But we also need to be over 5, 10, 20 years building up community institutions, community-based power that can continually say, hold those governments to account and actually like win change through pressure. And I think one of the things that throughout my career I've seen, I've been involved in public affairs and influencing politics from the other side, I've been involved in community organising, is that quite often we can achieve a win and we can see amazing progress happen at a national level, but then implementation maybe isn't very good, or then that progress rolls back really quickly. So it's kind of thinking about, as well as those intermediate steps, what are we doing to make sure that there is constant and consistent accountability that demands that they're heard and that demands that things get better. And that's where investing in something like organising alongside other levers, I think, gives you that vital ecosystem.
And there's something interesting there, isn't there, about kind of building the muscle and the capability for engaging and recognizing that we're starting at a relatively low base in this country with that, and that therefore persistence, both at both sides of it, both the holding to account and the involvement, is really, really important. I'm just going to pause and address the attendees at the webinar. I've got a few questions I can see coming into the Q&A now. Please do take this opportunity to join the conversation. I'm going to pick out one actually just now that came in from Tom Beresford, which picked up on a point I think you made earlier, Martha, which is about common ownership and governance of assets, because we know that can be very significant for well-being, and is a step on from just participation and engagement, but also we know the process of that can be very, very difficult and very time consuming for people who don't necessarily have the resources to devote to that. So I'm interested in what you're learning about the place of community governance and ownership of assets and what you would like to see happen next in relation to that.
I think one of the things that we're learning is that there is actually kind of quite a deep hunger for more circular local economies. And for example, we've been doing a piece of work in Wrexham, and we've been working with a lot of different community groups in Wrexham and the Community Organising Alliance together, creating communities. And the one issue that has consistently emerged is that all of those groups are raising money from kind of their service users, from the people who kind of come across their doors like desperately needing help, and they're just putting that money back into rent. And all of that rent is owned by private landlords, particularly Sports Direct, who are a huge landlord in Wrexham. So there's this kind of horror that the community is basically financing Sports Direct. And so they are now doing a piece of work to look at, like, what would an alternative be? Might it be kind of engagement with the local council to get free space? Might it be a more kind of community asset approach? And I think that sort of thing we are seeing time and time again. But I think one of the questions that Tom asked that I think is really interesting is participation enough? And I think what we would say is that the role of something like organising is that it builds up power to win change that matters to communities, be that kind of shifting ownership of assets or be that kind of influencing democratic structures. And we can't have those kind of big picture changes, A, if it's not what communities want, So organising starts from what is it that can really kind of matters to communities or make the biggest difference, but B, if they don't have the power to actually win that change and make sure that it lasts. So I think it's something about saying, yes, participation and organising maybe isn't the only thing, but it's a vital component in the types of transformation that we need to really increase our democratic well-being.
Yeah, and that understanding it as part of a whole ecosystem for well-being, it's something I find really helpful. So it's good to call that out. Jo, you've talked a bit about the role of prime ministers and the role of possibly particularly officials in local councils. And I'm interested to come back to that, this question of, I guess, responsibility and impact of political leaders at all levels, whether at UK level or devolved administrations and mayoralties at more local level. What really is the impact and the responsibility of those leaders in relation to our collective well-being in terms of democracy?
Well, I mean, I think it is significant in literally that leadership role, that setting an example about what's appropriate and that foundation. I mean, for example, like, can you imagine Theresa May in number 10 and people having those kind of parties? I mean, it's like a category error. It doesn't compute. She'd have, stamped on it immediately, right? So there's a tone that is set that that people then interpret throughout the system about what is possible, and therefore that setting of that tone really is a very strong, not the only determinant of the culture. So I think that is one way in which leadership does matter. And, I mean, you mentioned that one of the problems with democracy, according to the public, was corruption. I think that was the second highest. And when we saw yesterday, Transparency International, they released their new index of corruption of all the countries in the world. The UK has gone down significantly. We've fallen to the lowest level since the whole data set was being collected more than a decade ago. So, there are definitely issues there. But I think although leaders are important, I also think there is something around the sort of model that we have of almost expecting our leaders to solve the problems for us. And that happens at a national level, but even at a local, say, constituency level, for the MP to be seen, but also often to present themselves, and I totally recognise this is something I was guilty of too, as the person who could sort things out. And of course, you do need to play that role. There are people who are genuinely vulnerable, who wouldn't necessarily be able to advocate on their own behalf, and they absolutely need a champion, and absolutely that's appropriate. But also, I mean, I represented Eastern Partnershire, very kind of middle class, very high proportion of university degrees. Many of my constituents were more than capable of writing a stroppy letter and ought not to have needed a kind of follow-up letter from House of Commons notepaper for them to be able to be taken seriously by whatever agency they were raising a grievance with. So we've got a model that sort of relies overly on a member of parliament or on a political leader for somebody to be able to break through the system, and that in itself, I think, is a real problem. And I also think that sort of portrayal that it is about the person or the people who are elected solving everything for the public. Vote for me, I've got this brilliant plan, it will all be sorted, and you don't have to do anything about it other than put an X in the box next to my name. And that isn't realistic. I mean, it's not possible. It's also, in my view, not the healthiest kind of democracy. So how do we move? And it's difficult because of the electoral, the electoral pressure is very significant, right? If you are able to help somebody with a challenge that they have, they're more likely to vote for you. So, I mean, there's an incentive there for that model to perpetuate. But it would be a much healthier situation if there was a more facilitative role that leaders had of how can we get people to be taking agency within their own lives. And yes, absolutely being there for those who are particularly vulnerable and who, not forcing people into that at a time in their lives when they're not able to do that. And that is actually quite a different model of how we think about politics and political leaders and what it is to be in a democracy. Is it about voting every 4 years or every 2 years, every 5 minutes? It's felt like at times in the last decade. But is it just about that? Or surely it's about much more than that, both within communities through, co-op models or community organizations, within workplaces also. Martha, you mentioned the strikes. What is our role? What is our agency? And I think having a set of structures which recognise that it's not just a kind of hierarchical, the people who are actually the elected people are the beginning and the end of the democratic process, because they're not.
And that connects back, I think, Jo, to one of the comments you made earlier about civic education in schools. We've got a question from Aideen McGinley about that. If we're going to try and change that culture of how people understand their agency and how they see themselves interacting with different mechanisms that exist for engagement with the state, then that needs to start early. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about how you would like to see that developing over the next generation in our schools, but also in other places where young people engage and have their opinions and their ways of working formed.
I mean, to be honest, I'm going to now advocate for something that happens in Scotland, which is there is a subject in Scotland that doesn't seem to exist in English schools, not sure about Wales, to be honest, called modern studies. And I mean, you get citizenship and education as well, but it's basically a social science. So, you do a bit of history, you then do a bit of geography, and then you do a bit of modern studies, and then it's a subject that you can choose instead of those other humanities. And it basically combines a bit of politics, a bit of economics, and a bit of sociology is probably the easiest way to describe it. So when I was at school, we studied everything from racism in America to health inequalities to the trade between different countries in the world and what that meant in terms of inequality and international development, plus the democratic system in the UK, all of the different voting systems. I remembered, that we had a kind of table where you had the pluses and minuses of each one. I think in Scotland at one point we had almost all of them like in situ at the same time, actually working. But yeah, I mean, that is a great subject. And I have to say, the number of young people in Scotland that, I met in my constituency who'd got engaged in being more active in democratic life because of studying that at school. And it wasn't kind of relegated to part of the curriculum, which is often often the kind of PSHE style subjects are kind of seen as less important. There's not so much emphasis put into the teaching, but this being a core part of the curriculum, and an examined subject, if people choose to take it on further, I think it's a really good model. It's not maybe the only model. As I say, I got involved through the debating society. I mean, there's different ways that I think young people can be encouraged to actually do this through school councils and participation. My son's school, they've got community leaders. They do a kind of bottle refilling stall for your washing up and your shampoo and so on as part of the eco committee. There's all of these ways in which young people can actually practically be engaged in making change. And I think the feeling that you can do something and that understanding that your actions can make a difference is possibly one of the most important lessons.
Thanks, and I'm certainly a proud holder of higher modern studies, so I recognise a lot of what you say there. Martha, thinking about the pipeline to the community organisers of tomorrow, how would you like to shape what it is that young people are learning about their role and their voice in their communities?
I mean, I would just.
Who are you? Because you may well be doing that already.
Well, I would really agree with everything that Jo has said, and I think I have two extremely formative experiences from being at school. One was taking part in a mock election, and just the kind of energy and learning about politics through that. But then I also did A-level politics, so obviously I selected that as a choice. And honestly, more than my degree, I think back to that A-level politics and what an education it gave me in kind of how we can use our voice in politics as a force for good. And I think that has led me to really kind of agree with everything that Jo is saying, that we can do incredible things in schools. And actually where I'm currently calling in from today is a co-working space in Camberwell, and we share some space with an amazing organisation called the Politics Project, who are thinking really deeply about this and trying to inject political education across schools. So I'd really recommend looking them up. But I think in terms of the organisers of the future, this is actually something we're really seized of, because we're kind of looking across the landscape, and there is a bit of an organising workforce crisis. Actually, one of the things that we see is that it's quite hard to see organising as a viable career, because, to go back to Jo's point earlier about resources, it's really difficult to get long-term funding for organising work at the moment. So it's scrappy, it's hard to kind of build up a meaningful career in this space. But I think also one of the things that we're seeing is that organising as a practice is brilliant because it's grounded in self-determination. It's all about building the power of communities to win change that matters to them. but we see very few organisers coming from within minoritized communities or communities with lived experience of injustice. And that's one of the things we want to change as well. Like, how do we take that energy and make sure that the leaders from those communities are properly resourced, encouraged and enabled to pursue organising as a passion, to pursue organising as a career. And I think if we can tweak or change both of those two things, as well as actually resourcing the action, we can start to build up a workforce that can really sustain it and is much more reflective of society.
Yeah, thank you. I've got 9 questions that are coming in on the Q&A here, so I'm going to pick up a couple of those and encourage anyone who hasn't put one in yet to do so now. So there's something, just going back to the conversation we had about the nature and role of local government in the country, and a suggestion that the centralisation of local government, and we know that local government in our country tends to cover much bigger geographical areas than it does in many other European countries. Is it that centralisation which is forcing a distance between people and those who govern them? And is that what's creating the ground for this community organising, for good or for ill? Is there something about a gap we have to close there? And is there also something about the disrespect that is often evident between national government and local government, which is not healthy for democracy, because it almost dishonours the role, and Joe's already alluded to the impact of some of the cuts to local government. It dishonours the role of local government and therefore builds in a sense that is a layer of government which is not which doesn't have its place and is not worthy of respect, and therefore that feeds this sense of a lack of democratic health. So maybe coming to you, Joe, first, this question about the size and scale of local authorities and how it is possible to try and bridge the gap between people and authorities.
I mean, I think the centralisation I'm probably most worried about is the centralisation in a kind of Westminster or Holyrood situation. And I'm afraid I don't know enough about the situation in Wales to know if it's too centralised in Cardiff, but I can imagine it probably is as well. And I think that you're right that there are some local authorities that are very large, although there are often, even within those authorities, structures which could be utilised to have much more engagement, either individual wards, obviously, or kind of groupings of wards that that people can come together with. So I think that probably the local government structures that we have, could work, especially when you consider that there are also community councils and parish councils and so on. But I think the issue that was raised about, how much is local government respected? I mean, there is a dismissive attitude towards local government from central government, and as well as them obviously just not having a lot of this capacity in terms of being overburdened with statutory responsibilities and having very little resources to deal with it. I think another issue that's worth thinking about also in terms of local government is, who are our representatives at local levels, right? I mean, it is now often a paid role to be a local councillor, but often at a very, very low level. And so probably partly as a result of that it is vastly disproportionately people who are retired, who are able to dedicate some hours a week, or indeed people who are already wealthy and it isn't a problem for them not to have a significant income. And the proportion of kind of young people, and by which I don't just mean people in their 20s, but even people in their 30s and 40s within local government, is very, very small, and that has an impact on the legitimacy and the perspectives that actually get heard. And I also think it has an impact on the kind of dynamic between the local government officers and the elected representatives. When I think about when I was a government minister, and albeit a large portfolio, but being in the department physically Monday to Thursday every single week, and therefore able to have quite a hands-on role, when many councillors are, for the reasons I outlined, working on a very part-time basis, then there isn't necessarily that same democratic oversight in the same level of detail always of the officers, and then you're very reliant on which particular culture has risen up within that local authority. So I think there's a lot of challenges there with local government, and it's not perfect, so it's not like the only structure. I also think the kind of community ownership issue was a really interesting one that was raised, because that is part of this answer, I'm sure, in the same way that cooperatives or employee-owned companies can be really helpful in workplaces. one of the things that I think is the biggest gaps is, we're in this massive energy crisis. Part of that national security crisis, given we're reliant on Russian gas, where the reliance of Europe generally on Russian gas, and therefore the importance of winning ourselves off fossil fuels generally. It's also important for environmental reasons, which are also self-evident. And so having local energy generation from renewable sources that is distributed and decentralized and close to where people are using it and could be owned locally, which would help people with the cost of living crisis, would help with the environmental challenge, would make our energy system more resilient as well, and profits reinvested within the local community. I mean, to me, that seems an absolute no-brainer. And yet, of course, our financial systems are set up to favour massive, large projects that can get financing more easily. There's some interesting examples of people trying to do things a bit differently. I think it can be quite hard at community level. There's an organisation called Ripple, which is trying to set up energy co-ops to distribute. You can buy, for as little as £25 or often a bit more, but a tiny part of a wind farm, and you can then use that to cut your energy bills. Things like that, I think, are also quite interesting outside of the traditional democratic politics. How do people have agency and decision making over other aspects of their lives is a very important part of making sure that whole democratic picture works.
Yeah. Thanks, Jo. I spot that somebody in the Q&A has pointed out that I have been referring to putting questions in the chat, which is disabled. So just to be clear, please use the Q&A if you've got any questions, and we'll pick them up from there. Sorry about that. And I want to pick up a question, Martha, for you from that, which is about vulnerability. And the questioner is suspecting that sometimes vulnerability is used as an excuse by agencies for not engaging with people, and particularly those whose voices are often furthest. And this is a question from Dominika Novorowska. And I'd be interested in your experience. I think you touched on that a little bit in your last question. How is it that not only those communities or individuals are supported to engage, but also how do you build capacity in organisations to engage well with people who don't always find it easy to engage with the processes that have traditionally existed for consulting with and engaging with and enabling people to participate?
I think that is such an important point. And one of the things that we've been thinking about quite a bit is this sense of actually within organising, the purpose of organising is that we meet people as they are, and we don't put people in boxes, and we value everybody's opinion equally, and we think that everybody has a story to tell. And how do we enable that in terms of relationships with grassroots groups or relationships with local authorities or power holders? I think it's got to be utterly key in terms of taking the time, making sure that that's a top priority in terms of actually having a conversation with communities that are affected or defined as being vulnerable, and not presupposing what their needs and wants are. And I think there's a couple of examples here that I draw on. One is an amazing organisation called Act, Build, Change that I would, again, we work with them, would really strongly encourage people on the call to look them up. They're really interested in organising, but also how organising can be a holistic practice that really kind of understands that people will have different needs and different experiences, and how we bake that into things like radical safeguarding that trusts individuals and still wants to hear their voice, but is aware of kind of challenges in the environment. So I think definitely have a look at Act, Build, Change. But I also think there's this question of how do we level set right across the board and make sure that we aren't using that as an excuse in terms of cutting people out of conversations. And the other example I was going to use is Warm Welcome UK. So Warm Welcome have stood up thousands of warm spaces in response to the cost of living and energy crisis this winter. And one of the things that they're trying to inject into those warm spaces is not an assumption as to why people are using them, and not immediately kind of turning that into campaigning work, even though they desperately don't want to have to exist. But they're introducing a listening campaign just to spend time with people who are coming through the doors of those warm welcome spaces to understand, why are you here? And what matters to you, and what might make things a little bit better. And I think for me, there's something about not just in terms of local service engagement, but also when we're thinking about big picture campaigns and big picture responses to things like cost of living crisis, like energy crisis, is not to presuppose what matters to communities and always start from first principles in terms of just asking and listening, and then building those campaigns and movements around them.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I want to pull back now from that very grassroots level to the question of the structures and processes that we put in place at national level and what impact they may have on our democratic well-being. Two questions here. One from Carlton Smith about the introduction of ID cards. So the new verification, I mean, it uses the term ID cards, but we know there's a new level of identification and verification that's going to be required for voting, proposed by the current UK government. So interested to know your views on that, about whether that is effectively a chiller or a barrier effect on participation, particularly for young people. And then a question about referendums. To what extent are referendums a positive or a negative in terms of engaging people and feeling involved in the democratic process? And if a case can be made for those, then when can it? So I'm happy for you to pick one or both of those, Jo, to give us your comments.
Sure. So just, I mean, in terms of the question about voting and having to prove your identity, I mean, you know, voter fraud is a tiny issue. The extent to which it happens probably happened more in a kind of postal situation, and now they've got the signature verifiers and so on. So you know, the area where it was perhaps more vulnerable has actually been dealt with some years ago, and it feels to me like this is actually quite a spiteful voter suppression technique. I mean, I'll be very straightforward. I do not think this is about the integrity of our voting system at all. I think this is a fairly cynical move by the government to disenfranchise groups that they perceive will be less likely to vote for them. And I think we should be making it easy for people to vote. It should be a very straightforward thing, and in the absence of any evidence of widespread problems, we should not be putting additional hurdles in place for people. I mean, even if it is the number of times you're like knocking on doors on polling day and you say to people, you know it's polling day, and then they go, oh, I can't find my voting card, because you know they put it down somewhere and then the dog ate it, and you're like, you don't need your polling card to vote. Like, lots of people don't even realize that that's the case, right? You know, we should be making it as easy as possible. And then on referendums, I probably feel quite scarred by referendums, if I'm honest. And those of us in Scotland, you know, feel like we've had an extra dose. So I'm not a massive fan, I will say. I think they have a place, but I think to try and resolve an issue in a divided population, they do not work. I think when there is a complex issue, I think you have to be really careful about making sure there is time to have a debate, that there is clarity about what's on offer. So, you know, I feel, for example, that in 2016, basically, what was painted as what was on offer was something which was a mirage and that was not possible, and that part of the problem that we have had is that what was painted as possible has not been delivered because it could never be delivered, right? You know, to have all of the benefits and no downsides, you know, and the, you know, additional sovereignty, so I think that is the challenge with them. Unless you have a very specific proposal that there's not room for interpreting it in so many different ways, then you can get into worse problems in terms of the trust in the system, because then people vote for something and then they don't get what they think they voted for, or because actually people voting for something think they're voting for different things. So I mean, that is a real issue. That said, I have seen them work well. So late 1998, I think it was, there was a referendum on Scottish devolution, one in Wales obviously as well, and that I think was a very positive experience. But I think if we think about what preceded that referendum, there was a constitutional convention in Scotland which brought together political parties, lots of civil society groups, trade unions, faith groups, you know, right across business groups, right across the kind of public sphere of debate within Scotland, to spend time working out if there was going to be home rule, what could it look like, what would need to be present. And as a result, what was presented as a referendum for decision was the result of a lot of engagement already, and it was clear what was being offered. And as a result, you had, you know, a very high vote in favour. So I think to confirm a major constitutional change, a referendum is a tool that is perhaps the most the most appropriate tool, but I think it really needs to follow an intense period of engagement and consultation so that there is buy-in and that it is understood what is being put forward. I think when you're trying to use it to kind of resolve a controversial issue, all you find out is that your country is divided, and if anything, it just polarizes and makes those divisions worse. So I think it's sometimes used and seen by politicians as an easy way out of a difficult issue, and it doesn't actually solve that issue.
Thanks, Jo. Martha, any perspectives on that from your viewpoint?
I think just picking up on that final point that Jo made, we haven't spoken as much today about division, but that is one of the real challenges that our democracy is facing. We are seeing a society that is much more divided than ever before. And I think that the challenge with direct democracy like referendums is that they don't give us that opportunity to really kind of build relationship and understand where people are coming from. That is all part of the healing process in terms of building a healthy and flourishing society, but also in building a healthy and flourishing democracy. And one of the things I really like about the way that Carnegie talks about democracy and democratic well-being is the sense of it's not just the results, it's actually the participation, it's the day-to-day engagement. And if we're thinking at a more kind of holistic level, that sense of really getting to know the people that you live alongside or the people that share your interests, getting to know your elected politicians and breaking down those barriers, understanding where people are coming from, and then kind of finding common ground and building solidarity and campaigning together, that to me feels like a much more rich way to revitalize democracy than very kind of straightforward binary tools that often do entrench or reinforce division.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We're just coming to the end now, and I'm going to therefore end. While it's easy, as Roger Hickman said in his question early on in the Q&A, it's easy to spot deficiencies, and we've done quite a lot of spotting deficiencies. But we've also heard where there are green shoots. So I'd like to end by asking each of you, with apologies for the fact that we've not been able to get through all of the questions in the chat. But I'd like to ask each of you, what is your hope for optimism in the year ahead, and what would you like to share with the rest of the webinar so that we can all go away feeling positive about where change might happen? Martha, I'll start with you.
I think my hope to optimism is kind of closing where I opened, is that we're now seeing just like how much energy there is at a grassroots level and how much kind of communities are engaged in politics and want to do better. So my hope is that we actually change the picture in terms of the resources available and seriously start to be able to fund and prioritize funding work that is all about that democratic engagement and participation.
Thank you. Jo?
Well, I have hope for this year that we will start to see some restoration of standards at a national level. I think that's quite possible. And then at a local level, I mean, the key is being engaged and being involved. And so I suppose if everybody on this webinar can just think about, like, what can they do? Is there something more they could be involved in locally? And also importantly, something they can do to engage others who might not currently be engaged in the process, because there are, I think one of the challenges sometimes with the get involved and the consultations that exist is that the people that do it are the people who are already disproportionately represented, and those who might have challenges communicating within English, or people who are a lot younger, people who lack confidence in whatever way, or feel that the political democratic arena doesn't have people in it that represent them and look like them. For all sorts of different reasons, there are people who feel shut out of the way the systems work, and I think all of us can do more to try to make that experience a more inclusive experience. And just very briefly, maybe a final provocation to end on. Brenda had a question in the chat about young people and whether or not votes should be weighed for people who are currently underheard from. And one of the things I could probably not have said so much when I was actually a serving politician, but it's always struck me interesting that children don't get a vote. I mean, I appreciate that, a 2-year-old isn't going to be able to cast a vote on their own, but they're a person and maybe their parents could cast on their behalf. I appreciate this would politically be explosive, but why shouldn't it be one person, one vote, and everybody has a say, and then parents can think with their children at what point they actually transfer the ability for that child to decide themselves when they are able to make the decision. You know, you have a period where you perhaps do it together. But in terms of our short-termism of our democracy, not taking on board the big long-term challenges, not least environmental challenges, I think enfranchising, you know, the younger generation could actually be a really interesting change. So it's a kind of out there idea, but I think one that's worth provoking with.
Well, Jo, you finish very nicely on the well-being of future generations, which is something which is very close to our hearts at Carnegie UK as well. So thank you for that. That's 12 o'clock. I just want to end by extending huge thanks both to Martha and to Jo for being so generous in their time and sharing their thoughts on this really important issue with us this morning, and to the 50 or so of you who've spent an hour with us listening to this and thinking about it, giving your questions, and I hope going away to be the change we want to see. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.